Good afternoon, everyone. Before I get started, I would like to say this is a new area of research for me. I've typically written a couple of pieces on the representation of Black women, but from a local context. And so reading this particular work was new. I enjoyed thoroughly reading it. I think it merges a number of different literatures. And so I prepared a couple of written words for it as well. And it reads the following. It says, Reimagining Black Women, a critique of post-feminism and post-racial melodrama and culture and politics, employs a psychoanalysis to investigate the lamenity of Black women in melodrama and political culture. In a world that is often organized around anti-Black racism on the counterpublic, it is imperative that we interrogate how Black women are framed, the images used to describe them, and how they are projected into dominant political culture. Nikol's work raises important conversations about the representation of Black women, white nationalism, popular culture, and how these elements have been essential to understanding how we are portrayed in mass media. Her works pushes back against neoliberal notions of equality, post-racialism, and post-feminism, while calling specific attention to our turbulent political times that have rocked our democracy. Additionally, this work makes a significant contribution to the academic literature by addressing two areas that have been largely overlooked by feminist scholars, that is post-feminism and post-civil rights, by examining how these elements of race, gender, and class oftentimes interact. The cases selected in this particular text are carefully chosen because they fit the theoretical framework used to investigate this work. And so I read this from a number of different ways, but moving away from my written comments, one of the things I found interesting and striking was this idea that when it comes to Black women in particular, there's a glass ceiling. And so on the one hand, we describe and talk about women, and particularly in the text, the examples used both with Condoleezza Rice and the Obamas, and even the Medea exploration. On the one hand, we talk about women as being, as Zora Neale Hurston talks about, the mule of the world, right? And on the other hand, they are the glue that have held together Black communities and our world. And so what I think Nikol is doing in this work is talking about how Black women are limited. So if we think about Condoleezza Rice, on the one hand, she is the exception to the rule. And on the other hand, she represents the very essence of the negativity and the vitriol discussed. One of the things
how did the Beckys get all the acknowledgement?
Please mute yourself. Thank you.
So one of the things I also enjoyed in terms of reading this text was really unpacking what is Tyler Perry up to. And this discussion came about, I remember, what was the movie Tyler Perry wrote about, the one that had the negative reaction on Twitter and Facebook. It was a lot of them, but this was the last movie. And Nikol commented on something I wrote, and she said that Tyler Perry is not going to like my chapter on him at all. And so when she responded to that, she said, I'll send you the chapter. And I was excited when she invited me to be a part of this panel, because on the one hand, it raises the question, right? How do we portray Black women in mass media? And then how do we also endorse these notions of liberal equality? And so when we begin to unpack Tyler Perry's work, you begin to really look at the layers of what's at play here. I came along in the era where Diary of a Mad Black Woman, the Medea plays before he went to Hollywood, was really centered in our understanding. And for many of us, it was just laughs and giggles, right? It was the reminding of a grandmother, but then taking the psychoanalysis approach and applying this to Tyler Perry's experience with his mother and his father, and how he uses Medea as a way to limit the essence of Black women, was a new perspective that I had not considered in the past. And I also, Nikol, was interested to see, had you watched The Have and the Have-Nots? Because a lot of the framework that you used to describe Helen in The Diary of a Mad Black Woman, I think also applies to some of the very same things we see in The Have and the Have-Nots. But what's different, I think, with The Have and the Have-Nots is the racial element of Catherine, this powerful, rich white woman who is on the one hand a terrible person, and on the other hand, she's portrayed as this loving mother. And so when we talk about this anonymity of Black women, I don't necessarily see Catherine in that regard the same way Helen is portrayed. It's almost as if whiteness is given a pass in the same way that you talk about the romanticized version of how white men have raped Black women, and the movie The Help brushes over that particular element as well. And thinking about just future works, I certainly enjoyed the work, but one question I did have about this is there's a show called Pose, right, which deals with the show that called Pose, and I wonder how much of that can be related to this if you add the sexuality piece onto it, and the complexities of what does it mean for the trans community, right, when it comes to how womanness is portrayed in the mass media. I think that that raises some questions and frictions around that conversation. The other point I would like to make is I particularly enjoyed this idea of how you describe The Help and how it romanticizes or fails to address the suffering of Black women who were homemakers, because that is a real thing. And oftentimes it isn't portrayed, at least in the movie, is not given serious attention, and even in the text either. So these were some of my overall thoughts with respect to the book. One question I do have is, what does this emasculation look like of Black women in other segments of popular culture? What are the consequences it has for politics? I think that you're absolutely correct that the way melodramas portray Black people, it oftentimes places the onus of addressing systemic inequality on the individuals and not the system of the whole. And so if you look at Tyler Perry's work and a number of other works, there is this idea that Black success, or at least the pinnacle of Black success, is defined as reaching some economic status in some middle-class family. And so when we begin to think about progressive politics, when we begin to think about really dismantling systems, what impact does that have on our ability to aspire to transform and disrupt systems? And does the consumption of these melodramas within the form of within the context of Tyler Perry have consequences on really how we think about the political system, about what's possible? Because if we're conceptualizing success as from a systemic standpoint and using this romanticized version of the world to say that it's about individuals and their capacity to be successful, it draws attention away from how do we address systemic inequality? How do we address the system as a whole? And I think that Tyler Perry's work in particular places a lot of what Catherine Tate finds and what's going on, this move towards middle-class Black people, to a lot of these neoliberal tendencies that have been to the detriment of how we engage in the political world and the consequences of that. How am I doing on time? All right. The other point I want to make is, how does this work speak to the current political moment? As we think about white nationalism, as we think about the current insurrection, as we think about Donald Trump, as we think about these complex issues with respect to Black women, because I do believe that this is the era of Black women. This is the era of where sisters have taken over our politics, sisters have asserted themselves to organize. As we say in the South, sisters have done a lot of things. And so because of that, what are the consequences? What are the consequences of this? But also when we think, one interesting point, I want to back up a little. I really appreciated the use of Condoleezza Rice. All too often within the context of discussing Black politics, there's a focus on the liberal side and not what it means. So we see both for Democrats and Republicans, there seems to still be this limit. Even with Barack Obama, he had to convince the world that he was a Harvard-educated lawyer, and Donald Trump needed to be, to quote Coates, a white buster. So there's this limit of how we see the elevation of Black people's ability to influence systems. But I didn't clearly articulate my point on white nationalism and this turbulent politics here. I think that these images that we see, the personification of Black people in mass media and in melodramas, maintain profound implications for our contemporary politics, because often there is a consciousness that we are aware of systemic inequality, but as individuals, even me, we still engage in these neoliberal tendencies. We still engage in, while we understand there's systemic inequality, we still engage in neoliberalism in our daily lives. And so when we're consuming this on a daily basis, if this is part of our culture, it has to have some consequences for how we see the political world, and our functions in it. In terms of methods, as a scholar who does empirical research, I think you laid out the groundwork about you people who don't do this kind of research. You're going to see it as problematic, but it's okay. And this is why it's okay. From a INCOPE's traditional perspective in the traditional Black politics, I think you come out of the woodwork by citing the gatekeepers, our contemporary gatekeepers, Whitney Smoot, Nadia Brown, many of our INCOPE members who have centered the work of Black women, and you set that up very, very important at the gate. I've read so many works by major presses where scholars are saying things that INCOPE's members have said for years, and they not one cite any of our members. And I do appreciate that. I think that it centers the impact of what our members have done as it relates to investigating these issues. As an interdisciplinary scholar, I also appreciated the fact your attention to the interdisciplinary nature of this work, that you're merging the gender literature, you're merging political literature, psychology, and that it's merging in a way to really, really make sense and help the reader to walk through and understand what's happening here. Let me see if I have any other points. I have so many different notes, but I think that in this summarizes my questions, or at least my take on the work. I thought it was an excellent work, something different. Definitely pulled me into a new area of work that I haven't read before. And I think I'm going to definitely take this Tyler Perry chapter and use it as a discussion in some of my classes to just talk about how is it when we engage in genres that are problematic, can we enjoy them for the enjoyment and also call attention to the critical lens that we're looking at? And I think that you do an excellent job of really, really pushing us to think through these things through a different frame, and through a frame that I haven't seen used before at this level by merging across those various contexts. One thing to consider is what are some other areas, what are some other contemporary shows that we see Black people being portrayed, or Black women in particular being portrayed in a negative light, that speaks to this sort of this limit of how we see these elements.
Thank you, Dr. Riley. And under time, I appreciate it. You still had 2 minutes to go, so I appreciate your promptness. So since you've already spoken her name, we will ask Dr. Smooth to come to the floor.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carter. So wonderful to see my INCOPE's family here, even in a virtual space. I am thrilled to offer comments and reflections on reimagining Black women. I remember and can recall and started to see in print conversations that have occurred in the INCOPE's panels over the years. I could see the conversations we've had sitting in the lobby when we were likely needed to be in a panel, and the high kind of evening arguments around some of these concepts and ideas as Nikol was working them through. So it's such an esteemed pleasure to be able to comment on the totality of this work. So thank you so much, Nikol, for inviting me into this conversation. I want to say a couple of things before I get into my prepared remarks, because I do want to build this as a conversation. So I want to hit on a couple of things that Emmitt has shared with us before I get into my overall comments. One, I want to comment on the political astuteness of my colleague, Professor Riley. He reads the room accurately when he then salutes and affirms and recognizes the work of Black women, activists and scholars, and locating us as the center of Black politics. Because as Nikol's work shows us, and many of us in this room have written about, Black women's centrality to a Black political, both mobilizing agenda and theoretical agenda, has always been central to how we define Black politics, even before we were willing to recognize the power and astuteness of Black feminist theory and Black feminist scholarship as it manifests among Black political science. And so that's an important piece and space of growth that I want to mark. I'm having to grapple with my status as an elder in any room. So forgive me for having to stumble through that, but that's what I mean in essence, is to wear the role of elder to say that Nikol's work is also about a recognition that has been long underappreciated. So that brings me to my second point that I wanted to underscore from my colleague Emmitt's comments. I grimaced at first when he called Nadia and I and Nikol and Ange-Marie and Julia gatekeepers. I went, gatekeepers? Because my negative connotation of the gatekeeper is the one who keeps you out as opposed to the one who brings you in. And I appreciate close listening to my colleague to say that we are the scholars who were bringing people in. And I appreciate and pay homage to the fact that I heard you. But I also, because we have an intergenerational audience, out of that same moment, I want to say that Nikol's book, as well as her entire body of work, always reminds us and challenges us not to be lazy Black political scientists. And what I mean by that is that if we go by dominant training, we are often compelled to do collectivist research. And what I mean by collectivist research is that we are inclined to access only those works that appear easily on our click computer screen via our institutional libraries that are only subscribing to the major journals and are not offering anthologies online where you are most likely to find the works of Black feminist political scientists, and particularly the ones that Nikol cites throughout the book. You got to go deeper and you have to go harder. And I want to challenge our community conversation to do that, go deeper, go harder, and not a kind of collectivism type Black feminist political science. Now for my comments. I have to start off by saying, one, thank you, Nikol, for this writing. But not only thank you, Nikol, but I will tell the readers, for those of you who have not had the opportunity just yet to dive into this work, Nikol makes you work for it. She makes you work for it. She puts you out in a workout, an academic workout, and it is well worth the return on your investment. The ways in which Nikol is able to connect politics, political culture, psychoanalytic theory. I worked hard for what I got, and what I got was a hell of a lot. And I am so much the more blessed and enriched as a scholar for doing it. And when I get my students in this space, they're gonna be mad at Nikol, but they're gonna work out and we're gonna get it, and we're gonna get it good. I also wanna say, in situating this text, is that Nikol's work reminds us, and let me just say that I am a tenured professor in a department of women's gender and sexuality studies, and one of the leading departments in the country in terms of producing PhDs in women and gender studies. So I want to ground that in particular. And I am also an affiliate in my political science department and in public policy. And the reason why I situate that is because Nikol's book and Nikol's work reminds me of the importance of having Black feminist scholars who are trained in political science, using the tools of political science to offer a Black feminist critique. And it reminds me of what is lost in contemporary women's and gender studies in terms of the ways in which we are approaching Black feminism. Am I making an argument for an either or? No, I'm making an argument for a both and I'm making the place or calling out the need and the placement of Black feminism within the context of political science, because Nikol's work reminds us that we offer something distinctly different that we do not see in the ways in which gender scholars more broadly are trained. And so here are a few of my comments. Nikol offers us and challenges the premise, the personal becomes the political. And we know that familiar phrasing of second wave feminism, if you will. Nikol reminds us and asks us to consider the ways in which personal problems have moved into public spaces, but without an analysis necessarily of the structures that undergird personal problems, but an emphasis on just that, the individual and the personal, in particular through her lens of examining the neoliberal construct in relationship to melodrama. It makes me reflect on conversations that we have, so many of us on this Zoom have had over the contemporary failed collective potential of Black feminism and its attentiveness to structures and institutional powers. Instead, exchanging that for a quest for personal pleasure that's void of any institutional change element or a change narrative that is rooted in community constructs and challenging grand institutions. So often we have shifted in our understanding of Black feminist theory from a theory of material cultural critique and institutional critique to an emphasis on the individual that is also grounded in pleasure as politics. So I am very interested in Nikol elaborating on what is lost in our focus on and insistence on pleasure as the politics, as opposed to the dismantling of structures of oppression, but to call out individual pleasure as the dismantling project. Nikol then also, and I have to say, it is an incredible treatment. This book is an incredible treatment of formal politics and popular culture as they are simultaneously constructing or co-constructing each other, such that popular culture is being constructed by politics and formal politics is being constructed by popular culture, right? And we can think about some of the social policy literature that helps us to think about that further. In my short remaining time, and I thought I was gonna be really short, I wanna lift up Nikol's point on Black liminality and Black women. And this is one of also these questions on contemporary Black feminism, right? So Black liminality combined with this erosion of structural analysis, we have a type of Black feminism emerging that is fixated, Nikol, on rejecting the projected good versus evil binary, right? And wants us to constantly, the contemporary Black feminism wants us to continuously claim to not give a F, right? So we engage in a strong politics of anti-respectability. But as you eloquently illustrate, that very need to reject respectability politics reflects the trappings of concern with the individual on the one hand and simultaneously harbors a deep need to claim one's own performance that claims to reject the scripted drama, yet in doing so is a result in a trapping in that same liminality that you articulate about Black women as being trapped in this space of good and evil and this kind of binary. Finally, I want to put this out there because it was reminiscent of our San Diego conversations, and Tiffany Willoughby-Herard did a wonderful presentation when we were there, and we were considering these notions of self-care within the context of social movements. And I want to return to this point as a continuous in-COPE's conversation. Social movement activism in a contemporary context is very much interested in this focus on self-care, and self-care as a centralized component of contemporary movement. So I want to move between the neoliberalism and the melodrama that you talk about in the book. How do you read this emphasis on the self as a part of movement politics? And how do you interpret the move towards self-care politics through the lens of melodrama? How does the self-care narrative within movements show up as a personalized focus and perhaps moving us away from the structural power of social movements as being the power of the collective as opposed to the power of the individual? I'm going to stop there because I imagine in Q&A, someone will do the wonderful work of asking Professor Nikol to expand on her conversation of Kamala. And as a writing process, you ask us to consider a coda, I call it a coda 1. How did you resist the urge to write the coda 2 and prolong our abilities to savor the richness of this text? So a little bit on the writing process as well. Thank you so much for this incredible work and for bringing us into conversation. I yield back all of my time, Professor Carter.
I appreciate you so much, Dr. Smooth. I mean, you guys are doing great. I haven't had to cut anybody off or play no music to play anybody out, so I am thankful. But those are some really, really great comments, particularly your comment about being a gatekeeper, right? They don't just keep people out, they bring people in. And I think that's, you know, sort of the connective tissue of a lot of this work, right? It's about bringing people in and having a more robust discipline and a more thoughtful discipline, as it were. So I am now going to ask Dr. Tiffany Willoughby-Herard to present comments on this universally lauded text, and you too will have 15 minutes. So you can begin whenever you're ready.
Thank you so much. I thought I only had 7 minutes, which is just, I feel so incredibly blessed to have more time. So that's just wonderful. In honor of the politics of citationality, one of the things that I wanted to make sure to do was to honor how many people have come out of the NCOPE space equipped to be able to think in this kind of way that's not just interdisciplinary, but that takes up both popular culture and mass media on the one hand, and really revels in the humanistically oriented political science. And so I'm thinking about the ways that this book is part of a really vibrant tradition of Black politics scholars thinking about film, thinking about dance, thinking about the arts. The person who came to mind most often for me was David Coben, right? Who has published 5 books of historical fiction going all the way back to 1987, in addition to political histories of Black movements in Brazil. So we have produced an entire body of work. So we have people who are part of the organization who are key strategists of political movements, but who also spend a lot of time working in the frame of culture as well. So I'm actually going to stop sharing the slides now and just get into the kind of heavy lifting of this paper, if you all don't mind. Okay. So while on the one hand, political science has a relatively impoverished level of attention to creative works, popular culture, and mass media, political scientists like David Coven and political activists like Randall Robinson nurtured in NCOPE's humanistically oriented political science have produced massive bodies of work that are about the politics of creativity and the politics of the imagination. Nikol Alexander-Floyd's book, Reimagining Black Women, fits squarely within long-standing commitments among this group of political scientists and political historians to think about the political economy of popular culture, literary and aesthetic representation, media, and the actual history of producing these forms, as well as a robust tradition of creating artistic and literary works themselves, too. While Alexander Floyd labors to help us understand that politics definitely still matters, we realize that her psychoanalytic deconstruction of the present demands that we ask of politics, historiography, and theory, whose culture is this anyway? Floyd's intervention turns toward the dynamics of post-feminist politics as one type of racialized post-civil rights ideology that facilitates and legitimizes political retrenchment. For Floyd, post-feminist politics marshals and deploys an ageist and racist attack on feminism in ways that have particular effects, one might say demobilizing and depoliticizing effects on Black women and Black gender politics, especially as these post-politics ideologies in popular culture become essential scripts for interpreting and making meaning about the persistence of discrimination in formal politics. Mass popular culture and formal politics seem to be combatants warring over the prize of how the public understands and participates in politics. Post-feminism, while accusing feminist politics and praxis of being long in the tooth and irrelevant, attempts to convince all of us that, one, the politics of the past have achieved their goals of expanding democracy. Two, social justice has been reached, and as it turns out, was really never even necessary at all. And three, young people obsessed with the universe of the self ought to be engaged in branding and self-actualization, sans accountability, collectivity, or organizational skill building. In such a present, liberation does not have to be fought over, fought about, or fought for. And the symbols, calls to action, slogans, placards, practices of listening and learning from community-led struggles, and the multitudinous heterogeneous movement techniques and actual goals for policy change are simply incorporated and churned out as marketing tools for Americana. Indeed, it is the people who articulate a need to discuss politics and political education who are themselves deemed the problem, not endemic or institutionalized forms of grave harm or state-managed and capital-produced injury. The chapter on Condoleezza Rice accounts for Black conservatives articulating a set of desires or aspirations for colorblind national community that may be submerged inside the larger Black community. These overlooked aspirations and a kind of libidinal economy make Black ideologies and beliefs appear to hew to narrow liberal left trains of thinking and find us missing the opportunity to very seriously interrogate racial, class, and gender triumphalism and individualistic narratives of uplift, and the melodramatic cultural storylines used to brand their legitimacy. Thinking about Condoleezza Rice's liminal status, included and necessary as a trusty, loyal servant with special access who is close to the presidency, but also excluded through a psychoanalytic register, offers us lots of insights into exploring the melodrama of closeness. Rice, intelligent, assertive, single, childless, was folded into the role of family trustee and approved of work wife, international diplomacy aside. Rice becoming like a member of the family, thereby was no longer a threat as a decision maker in the public sphere. Condoleezza Rice and all this messy closeness and influence through narration returned conservatives to an enduring and comforting role for Black women inside domestic life, and returned left liberals to an account where Black women's main influence relies on being inside the house, and in Rice's instance, as a warrior betrayer of Black people in order to advance her own self. Think symbolically representative faces in high places, used to carve out all traces of substantive equality. But for Alexander-Floyd, it's not just the faces, it's also the storylines and psyches in high places that matter. The notion of Black womanhood supportive of state power satisfies conservatives' wet dreams of a revived plantocracy at the same time that it gratifies left liberals' fantasy of having an easy raced and gendered sellout to blame for US empire. Both partisan camps deploying racialized gendered images and tropes about Black women that traffic in enslaved Black women's suffering, while turning that suffering into myths about seduction and sexual conspiracy, and of all things, consent. Here is the latent desire that white psyches rely upon, and the gauntlet through which Black women political actors are flayed. Black women, as it turns out, really just desire white men, and all women, as it turns out, really desire lawful marriage to men. Even in our sites of extraordinary critique of American empire, misogynoir allowed left liberal critics space to sexualize Condoleezza Rice and to openly desire her, because as a Black woman, her primary role in any scene is as a screen for telling stories from many communities having accepted a kind of amnesia about their past. The chapter on Barack Obama asks, how do gender, race, and class shape elected officials' personal narratives and electoral strategies, not only in terms of issue choice, but also in terms of narrative framing? This question is particularly important because gendered, raced, and classed ideologies shape how candidates choose which issues to align with and how to tell their stories. In Obama's case, the story of racism, sexism, and poverty are largely individual stories of individuals lacking the internal resources to overcome structures of domination. Pairing ideologies of Black cultural pathology against the improbable story of his own private American miracle left those subject to the very real injuries of racism, sexism, and poverty, with Horatio Alger narratives trotted out time and again when power needs a mystified account of its operations. In this form of multiculturalism, all forms of harm are basically the same, emerging primarily as interpersonal conflicts, and where structural discrimination is so rare, it's improbable to call it harm at all. But we have learned all too bitterly from organizations like White Coats for Black Lives, which had an incredibly active chapter here at Irvine, a Black doctor-led campaign working to raise awareness that racism is a public health crisis that resulted in astronomical proportions of Black, Latinx, and Native people dying from COVID-19. We have learned that the world of Shondaland, as absorbing as it may be, is not the past and is certainly not the present. Indeed, as Dr. Donna Adams, an obstetrics and gynecology doctor, demanded in an open letter that became a protest mantra in 2020 said, quote, "Make a promise to us, America. We Black medical professionals and caregivers made a promise to care for your children. Make a promise to do better by our children. Allow us to breathe." But melodrama lures us away from thinking about the need for politics as praxis, politics as interrogation of historiography, and politics as a site for meaning making about ethics and right action. In this tour de force, Alexander-Floyd explores the sets of desires that make storytelling more satisfying than careful, dogged political education. Thank you.
Are you finished, Dr.
Oh,
Hall?
yes, I am. Thank you.
Okay, I wasn't sure. I thought you were pausing. Thank you so much for those really incisive and detailed comments. Dr. Samuels, you're up next and you will have 15 minutes as well. And then we will turn it over to Dr. Alexander-Floyd, who has some great commentary to respond to. You're on, there you go. I was like,
there we go. There we go. And I wanted to, I'm not going to take nearly as much that much time. I made a mistake in terms of time zone, and I'm late here. So I don't want to try to take up too much of your time. So what I wanted to, one of the things I really appreciate about this particular work is, and this has been one of the things that Dr. Floyd has been doing for quite some time, is the focus on popular culture as a window for really understanding larger phenomena. And I think that's a very important way of looking at politics. And sometimes, at least some of us tend to neglect. But sometimes popular culture is a very important way of really getting windows into the larger culture and larger culture and larger political phenomena, and also the importance of storytelling. Also, one of the things that in particular that I find interesting is she talks about how the significance of the Moynihan Report as one of these important demarcation points that seems to occur simultaneously as a lot of other things are happening in society. You know, 1965 is also the signing of the Voting Rights Act. You know, it was the Independence Bridge, but it's also the same year that Watts happens. So just as the American lexicon is incorporating the word institutional racism, there is this rebuttal with starting with things like the Moynihan Report, is that there's a shift away from, or a denial of any structural implications or any structural causes to the maintenance of Black inequality. We've done that civil rights thing, folks. We've passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. We passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So what more do you want? This is now an issue of individual conduct, individual morality. Let's shift the focus to what Black people are doing for themselves. And also, this is also the same period of time where the more punitive policies in terms of criminal justice are going to start to be implemented as well. They're also shift. So I think that one thing I really like about this work, and you know, and you kind of put that Moynihan report in context in a way that I guess I thought about it, but I really thought about it as a really important point in this transition. Transition, yeah. I just want. Another thing I like about this work too, and we talked. Nikol and I had this conversation. When we were talking about the chapter, particularly on Condoleezza Rice. Condoleezza Rice is that I think she has a remarkable ability, to actually write what a lot of us were thinking. Because I remember in some ways living through that period of watching her rise first to in the Bush administration to national security advisor, and then moving as Secretary of State. And on one level, we are being pulled to view this as a sign of progress. I personally was ticked off with her because I saw her as a political scientist using the tools of the trade to basically rationalize and justify a lot of fascist and retrograde policies. But on one hand, we were being pulled this way, but I like the continuity that you draw between, on one hand, this appearance that this is a symbol of progress, along with the Black mammy image, the sense of she's close to the Bush family, and that explains. So that explains her access, not just her confidence. And so I think that the juxtaposition here I find it very interesting. I think I remember when you made the reference to I think some of the late night jokes that were made about her. And I think the one particularly from Jay Leno, I was like, what? I remember that episode of thinking about that. And I was thinking, yeah, that's kind of. And I thought about, yeah, that was good. I said, wait a minute, that's not funny. Mm-hmm. But so I think I think one of the remarkable things I like about this is that you actually put on paper what a lot of us were thinking about this, and I appreciate that. I'm gonna, since I came in late and and everything else, I'm gonna stop here so that Dr. Alexander-Floyd gets the chance to weigh in and other folks get to say something. But I'm looking forward to the rest of this conversation. But this is a very I think this is a very powerful and timely work that brings to the fore a lot of the significance of popular culture as a window of understanding these political realities, and specifically this shift, this shift away from systemic and institutional explanations for inequality toward more individualistic based ones.
Wow, thank you so much, Dr. Sanos. So we're going to now invite Dr. Alexander-Floyd to respond or bring any commentary that she may have about her new text.
Okay, we'll try to just give me 5, no more than 7 minutes. So I want to give people a chance to ask questions. First, I thank you isn't adequate for expressing the gratitude that I feel for you, Wendy and Albert and Emmitt and Tiffany, for just honoring me with engaging this work. And if of course, you know, if you need me for anything, you can always ask. And if you want me to, famous last words. But if it teach it in your class, if you think it would be useful, sometimes it hems people up. I wouldn't mind, you know, coming in and engaging with folks. I just want to first, I'm trying to say this without crying. I thank God for this day, because it's been a long day coming. And at times I have wondered if it would, if this process was taking too long for a variety of reasons, the vicissitudes of life, of course, but also just the process that it required. I read in a journal recently, I journal a lot, but they're not in any order. I just happened to be procrastinating, actually. I found some notes I had. Shouldn't tell people this. But anyway, long story short, I was journaling about my next book. And part of what I said was, you know, I can do this, and I think it'll be quick for me to do. Yeah, I think everybody could laugh right there. You know, part of what interdisciplinarity does cause us to do is to actually, I believe, take, not to foreground our approach, but to foreground our questions and think about how best to answer them. The kinds of questions that I had, I didn't have enough tools, although some of the right tools are well-developed tools enough to do the kind of analysis that I wanted to do. And so, you know, I did what I thought I would never do, which is to actually go back to school. so I can do this and specifically get more training in psychoanalysis. So I'm grateful for this moment and for your just engaging this work. And I just say that as to be transparent and also to encourage anyone who is still in the press. It all adds up. And keep going. Also, I just want to, I'm mindful today, you know, the question of the frame about gatekeepers, that took me, you know, by surprise too, because that's definitely not a way that, you know, I ever think about myself, but the whole idea of making space for other people to do work. Because somebody said, if you can do, if you have a vision and you could do it by yourself, then it's not really a vision. And the work that we have to do to understand Black politics and Black women as political actors is, in my view, all hands on deck matter that has to be engaged at different levels of scale, different levels of emphasis. People may have different things that they work on. Some people may center it, as some of us have, but it is critical and it requires a lot of work. And it's hard to start mentioning people because, you know, the danger of forgetting people, and there are so many people, but this year is the 30th anniversary of Jewel Lamar Presage's seminal piece, In Quest of African-American Political Woman. And we're gonna have some panels this week that will honor that, and other things this year that will honor that. And so I just lift up her name and her work and her life today. In her absence, May King, who is not here. She's here with us, but not at the conference. And Linda Williams and Jerry Jackson, Sister Braxton, Dr. Braxton, you know, and Elsie Scott, right? And Sheila Harmon Martin, and all the people who do the scholarship of research, but also the scholarship of service and institution building. And there are lots of people that I could name, but I just wanted to point those out. I guess I will go into, I'll share my screen quickly. I can't do that. So I'll describe what I would share on my screen.
Let me make you the hostess. If I make you the hostess or one of the co-hosts,
okay.
I think you can share.
Okay, good. So one of the questions, some of the questions tied together Emmitt talked about pose, and also, as Wendy mentioned, how did I sidestep doing a coda too to talk about Kamala. There are, on the question of sexuality and transsexuality, queer theory in general, I think that, I hope what it is that I've done has been a clearing space for additional work. And there are lots of definitely different, cultural markers and sites that could be very ripe for a political science analysis that can understand the interconnections, among and between formal politics, informal politics, and our cultural fantasies and narratives. I don't watch polls. I do
And
watch.
you're also co-host now.
I'm cut off.
If you want to share your screen, you're
Okay.
co-host now, so you should be able to do that.
Oh, all right, good deal. But I think that many of the ways that people talk about or signify Black women as liminal subjects is definitely applicable to trans folk and queer folk in general. Part of what I have here is an image from a figure that's in my book, and it just basically tries to capture the relationship among various parts conceptually. I was interested in the stories, right? That the kind of transmission of really what should be public concerns into private spaces, and the emphasis that melodrama has on pure victors and pure villains and pathos-driven narratives. And so I focus on Black people in general and Black women in particular, but there are ways in which the ideas about liminality in that framework is unfortunately utilized across different types of populations and groups. And so you can think through it in that frame where people are either framed as being good, respectable citizens, or bad or abject others. And I don't exactly follow Kristeva in her ideas of about the abject, but we know the abject is people who are constructed as abject or abjected are seen as human waste and pollution. Right? And so that definitely is something that ties into the politics of the moment. Earlier in the month, when Stephanie Williams and Albert and I did a kind of take on the insurrection and the impeachment, et cetera, my contribution dealt with fascism, right? And the way in which the insurrection and also just Trump's legacy in particular and the ideology that he supports really falls within fascistic ideas about authoritarianism, about deep levels of identification that people have with him as a kind of Superman figure that's at the same time also a relatable everyman. But the nationalism is a key feature. Not all nationalisms are fascistic, but nationalism is a key aspect of authoritarian types of politics like fascism. And so it connects very deeply in that way. And political scientists, as I note in the book, have actually been at the forefront of theorizing white nationalism, not only in terms of the Tiki Torch crowd, but in terms of how white nationalism can be identified with the state. And that's a key contribution as a discipline that we can bring forward, I believe, in this moment. I also talk about sadomasochism as an analytic of power. And we can think about the types of attachment and idealization that we see with Trump-like figures. There will be others, sadly, and have been others. But that sadomasochistic dynamic where people are actually seeing themselves identified with authoritarian figures, see themselves submitting everything, not only material material things, but also literally at times their bodies. And we all remember the white woman who said that she would literally walk in the rain barefoot to go and see Trump. I mean, that's a stark example of that principle, but that's part of what people confuse masochism with the desire or love of pain. It actually, particularly in its political dimensions, focuses on a giving over of the will of one to another, a person, or even a movement, right? Mm-hmm. And Margot V. Perkins talks about this very, very well in terms of her work on Black nationalist movements. The second set of questions. Okay, so, well, the book had to end. It was already waiting on like one last third reviewer that, the only reason I had a chance to write a coda is because somebody was late on getting back, some element of whatever. So I'm like, hey, we're in the middle of a pandemic, might as well put a coda on there. I do, and maybe having that coda, it took a bit of emphasis away of how I deal with Kamala Harris as a political figure in the conclusion. I do mark her as one example of that. And so I didn't change the conclusion to reflect anything beyond her candidacy, just as a matter of having to finish. And I wrote about it in an essay. I got asked to do an essay, and I wrote about her and Michelle Obama in a piece that I think came out in September, October, called "I Want to Be Like Michelle or Kamala" for New Political Science. So that's coda part 2. If anybody wants to talk about that piece, we can. So the writing process piece, it just had to end. It just had to end.
You can't do it all in one book. You can't write it all.
When I was thinking about a second project, I actually, every chapter was actually an idea I had for a book all on its own. And when I start to get more into post-racial theory and post-feminist theory, it actually it provided me a frame for thinking about all these things that I felt were connected, but couldn't figure out how, right? And so I'm glad that that I came upon that, because it helped me to make sense, of the puzzle that I was seeing. And it made it more complicated in some ways. One reviewer said that you seem to have thrown everything in but the bathtub or something, whatever metaphor is. I'm like, actually there is a method to the madness. It's an epistemology of witnessing, right? Because it actually showcases the developments around post-feminist and post-racial politics, as they developed over time. And I'll just end with saying that part of what I think the contribution of really centering Black women in the discussion does, and Black politics, is to help us to see neoliberalism emanating at a much earlier starting point, and to understand the processes of racialization and engendering and class dynamics as they evolved with the kind of text of the Moynihan Report. And so, if we center liberal white middle class experience, then the kind of Angela McRobbie idea of the doing and undoing of feminism, which is important, I believe that's a critical insight, seems to be a kind of dominant thing. But post-politics or post-feminist, post-civil rights politics, I argue is best understood as a repertoire of fantasies, narratives, and ideologies that suggest that politics that are social justice oriented are no longer necessary, and that takes our eyes off of the macro institution of the state to thinking through beyond the self. And so these figures are also in the book. This idea is something that just an example of how liminality plays out. The super minorities, the president, I should say this, but the president, I would argue that the president of many universities, possibly including my own, fall into this category. And people are, the super minority figures sometimes a framing that one doesn't take on, right? You're framed with it. But there are ways in which people play into that idea, or even the idea of the magical Negro frame, right? But the idea of role modeling our way out of systemic inequality is still something that has a lot of traction in Black politics and US politics at large. And so, I do critique President Obama in terms of his My Brother's Keepers initiative in this regard, and also try to make sense of sexual harassment and sexual violence, specifically in terms of understanding Cosby and Bill Cosby as really a kind of expression of perversion that actually, it's a play on the idea of perversion, right? Because he's instantiating an idea of patriarchy and manhood to deal with his hurt places, his wounded masculinity. And so we often think of what we've come to focus on in terms of his sexual predation as being at odds with his persona as the father, a father symbol, but actually they're deeply tied together. And that's part of what I try to deal with too. I'll stop here. I thank you again so much for just blessing me with, interacting with the work and having a conversation. I deeply appreciate it.
Well, thank you for that. And thank you for giving us some more insight into the work and sort of how your thought process for putting the work together. And then in the interest of time, we only have a few minutes left. Are there any questions, comments, or things that we can sort of talk about with the time we have left, or something that you at least wanted to maybe have on Dr. Alexander-Floyd's radar as the book moves through and as we are thinking about this work? As political scientists, this sort of really liberatory project, is there for anybody who wants to engage?
I want to ask you a little bit more about the creative writing and the willingness to look at popular culture that's part of the NCOPE's tradition. And I was wondering if you would share some of that genealogy for you.
That's a good question. I think that, it's always been, a point of interest. It definitely is, something, like you said, that's been part of what we have done, at NCOPE's, particularly, political theorists who have looked at popular culture and formal politics and political discourse. My training in women politics and feminist theory, of course, I think amplifies that. But it's the discussions around female-headed single-parent households in particular, and to see that on the screen. I was coming of age at a moment when Boys in the Hood was popular, Menace to Society, all of these different things. And so, you really couldn't escape, in my view, seeing those connections and having to try to make sense of it. And then Grey's Anatomy was just something my students wanted me to see, because when they watched it, all they saw was like super feminism. And when I watched it, because they suggested that I do, I like some of the characters, don't get me wrong, but I saw kind of do me feminism, where sexual liberation was the kind of the limit of what feminism could be, and very little, I think, honest depiction of what people, white women and racial minorities, actually have to deal with in professions like medicine. And it was just the itch I had to scratch. I watched Crash and I said, well, since I went through the trauma of it, let me just write about it. And one of my themes is don't get mad, get published. So my idea was to put like a couple of things that really irritated me in one chapter and then go on with my life. You know, an article on that, Crash, and President Obama's 2008 campaign. And, you know, that actually became the basis of, part of the basis of a book. But it didn't start out that way.
And I don't know if anybody else has a question, but you said this was your motto, don't get mad, get published. How do you do that? So how do you take, in 2 minutes, right? How do you take something that you're very interested in the world, right? Whether it be Grey's Anatomy or some other thing that you're interested in, and turn it into something for academic audiences and something that, you know, you can talk with your peers about?
I basically just go follow my heart. I mean, I always pray and ask God to help me to write what He wants me to write, because we have limited time. But usually the things that, you know, stuff that just irritates me and that I see as a problem, you know, like, and, you know, even like the Condoleezza Rice stuff, I'm like, why isn't anybody talking about her? Because, like, you know, I'm like, she's, and then I, you know, eventually I you know, I said, duh, you're a political scientist, but you're right about her. But then it made me think, why aren't we concerned about Condoleezza Rice? You know, why do we stray away from some elements of Black politics, the repressed parts? But the things that really, like that pleasure politics, Jennifer Nash, her book is right here.
Okay, come on, Dr. Nikol Alexander-Floyd.
If I can, I just on this for some time between now and August, we're gonna have a friendly encounter on a page with that. And because that piece, definitely, I think there are certain ways that you can think about, you know, self-care, survival, right, is a part of, it can be seen as a part of a mode of resistance, as Angela Davis talks about. But, you know, we can't spot our way out of inequality either. And so as we theorize about that, we have to be cognizant of those things. But
I say masturbate our way out of political dilemmas. I think that's the piece that your book, and I want, as we continue to teach it and to think critically through it, it's like, we got to really think about what is the state of a Black feminism that's void of a structural critique. And I'm all for people getting off. Sorry, y'all. But I also want you to politicize. I want you to be politicized and institutionally grounded with your pleasure.
Yeah, that would be a great special issue for
NRBP.
Yep.
NRBP.
So somebody,
that on the list.
somebody needs to do a genealogy of the renewed discourse around pleasure, because there's a false ring to it. I mean, part of the framing of it suggests that somehow feminists weren't concerned about pleasure, Black people weren't concerned about pleasure. I mean, the way that it's read, and Jennifer Nash talked about how her impetus for her first book, she said it was inspired by the queer theory that she read in graduate school, because pleasure wasn't a concept that she saw being centered in the same way by Black feminists. But that's a really false kind of framing. And it also ties into post-feminism in a different way, in terms of dating panic and in terms of, God, it's a complex, but, you know, I think it's not surprising that pleasure politics gets a certain level of priority for people who are influenced, you know, in a particular time period. Because people are, what comes to mind, an article I read about somebody talking about the politics of Beyonce, and she was teaching us how to have sexual freedom. I'm like, really? This Beyonce does this. She could take notes from other, that's just not but the limit of politics cannot be focused on the individual and focused on self-pleasure and self-actualization. It's a problem. In one instance, someone was trying to argue that we have to talk about sexual pleasure in the context of enslavement for Black people. We didn't come to a place of resolution, but it's something that needs to be addressed because it's taking.
But can I say this in the interest of time? Because I'm sorry, we are a bit over. So I mean, I'm happy to. I don't know if we have just unlimited time. I don't know what the universe of a digital conference will allow. And I think, was that you, Dr. Smooth, speaking? I'm sorry, I didn't want to cut you off. I think we were speaking at the same time.
Yeah, I was just going to quickly say, because I wanted to engage that point that Nikol is making about freedom politics. I think we do have to have revisit a conversation on what constitutes a freedom politics in the context of Black women's lives. And in your book, I'm hearing this kind of call for a return to a materialist critique.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I would, and I would add to that a kind of institutionally grounded critique that is not just simply a kind of broad brush of the state, the man, whatever, that doesn't name, the opposition and create a pathway or a disentanglement of that actor. But I'm kind of curious on Professor Carter's read on pleasure and freedom in this context, because you've written about this as well.
Yeah, I mean, but my critique was more not so much about the pleasure of it, but the way in which, to Dr. Alexander-Floyd's point about sort of abjection about the way we treat certain people as beyond sort of the pale, right? They're not part of the community. So we shouldn't be alarmed about the racism in pornography because those people are the dirty, bad people, right? So mine wasn't so much about whether that was a liberatory practice. It's a job that people do. That was more my concern, in that if we were going to have an inclusive Blackness, then we need to have an inclusive Blackness that includes those people, right? And there's a way in which we sort of cordon off that world while we're having these conversations about the movie industry and how racist and exclusionary it is, right? Oscar so white and all this other stuff. But there are, these porn performers and other kinds of sex workers who are talking about the rampant pay discrimination and racism that they experience, and not a mumbling word, right, from any of these same forces, because we view those people as over there people and not right here people. And I think, that was sort of my concern. I agree with Dr. Alexander-Floyd about sexual liberation, power. All of those things are not news, right? If you've been paying attention to Black women and Black authors, people have been singing about it, writing about it, making poems about it, painting about it, all kinds of things about all kinds of liberatory practices around their bodies. But we don't acknowledge it because I think we all like to feel like we're the cutting edge and we're starting something new, when it's like, no. Right, we've been doing that.
That's critical, and I guess the question is like, what does this particular iteration? How does it function?
Yeah.
Why does it arrive, and how does it function in this moment? But the Jennifer Nash.
So I'm going to have to step out. I have another class I have to get to, but I want to thank y'all for this conversation, and I really do hope this special issue of NRBP comes out sooner rather than later, because we need it.
You're gonna do it.
From the people in this,
somebody
gave me a job.
You do that.
Okay, you heard it.
That's what happens when you have suggestions.
You do that.
No, I didn't. Well, somebody else suggested it.
This session is recording. We got you on tape.
didn't say me. I just said stop.
You know what? This is why I'm not coming back to this conference. I'm not coming back. But I do want to thank you again. I do want to thank you again, Dr. Alexander-Floyd, for writing this book and for giving us another sort of vocabulary and language to talk about Black women and the ways we can love on Black women that have lots of different possibilities. So I just want to thank you for this book and thank our colleagues for coming with such amazing comments and insights. You guys were amazing as a panel. So I want to thank you all. And I'm sorry I have to make such an inauspicious exit, but I am late for a class. But it's so good to see y'all.
Good to
Stay
see
safe,
you too.
stay sane.
And this
remember the
chapter on
information here.
This chapter on Condoleezza Rice, y'all, was a Best Paper Prize award-winning INCOPE's paper some years back, or one of the germination of this idea. So when you write your papers at INCOPE's, know that we're critiquing, we're uplifting, we're celebrating, and then it becomes a part of your published work.
The chapter on Grey's Anatomy Crash and Obama won the Rodney Higgins Award.
Yes, so two.
Wendy right there.
Yeah.
So yeah, INCOPE's is critical.
Good stuff.
Publish your stuff.
Good to see y'all.
And I got to read it before it became that.
It's so good to see y'all. Thank you again. And remember the wisdom that was dropped in this panel, right? Gatekeepers also let people in, but don't get mad, get published. See y'all later.
Okay.
Have a good one.
Thank you.
Congratulations, Nikol.